So today we are starting Daoism, which we will focus on Laozi this week, who is considered the founder of the tradition. And then we'll focus next week on his main disciple, Zhuangzi, sort of like we focused on Kongzi's main disciple last week. So yeah, we are though again at an interesting point in the term. So with that, let's get started on Daoism. I do want to let you know that I did add a couple things to the module just yesterday. So in case you haven't looked at it since then, I want to show you where it is. So sharing my screen. I mentioned that I had some graphic novels. So I scanned the little intro that gives you a sort of biographical story about Laozi. So some of that is in the readings as well, but here you can have some nice drawings to go along with it. And same thing for some of the selections from the Daodejing, right, which is the text in Daoism, the primary text. So here we have some of those from the graphic novel as well. So just added maybe duplicates of some of the actual readings, but with some nice pictures. So feel free to utilize those. All right. Sorry, I've got like a million windows open. Now I can see that. All right. So when we're talking about Daoism in the context of Chinese religious traditions, right? Chinese Eastern philosophical traditions. We talked about the Warring States period with regards to Confucianism. So who wants to actually, stop sharing for a second, who wants to remind us of what was going on in the Warring States period in ancient China? We pick on somebody? Maxwell, what's going on in the Warring States period? Also known as the 100 Schools period. Civil War, absolutely, right? So the warring states, right? Like the states of a nation, exactly, right? And so this was the chaos, the disharmony, the suffering that Chinese philosophical traditions are trying to alleviate, right? So reflecting back, Hinduism and Buddhism were also trying to address the suffering, right? But the suffering that was in all of samsara, right? That just permeated all material existence. Little more of a caveat here, right, with the Confucian and Taoist traditions. It's that material existence need not always be suffering, right, or always entail some type of suffering, right? Both the Confucian and Taoist traditions are going to say there were times in ancient history and human history where we had peace, right? So we need to recapture those harmonious times, right? And they're going to be different for each tradition, but they both refer to them as the golden age. Okay, so for Confucius, for Kongzi, the golden age he was trying to recapture was the Western Zhou dynasty, where this under him was a feudal system, and he thought things were quite peaceful, and so that's the sort of hierarchy and harmonious hierarchical system he's trying to reinstate, recapture. But where the people again at the top, the leaders, right, are exemplars of virtue for that trickle down theory of virtue. Taoism is going to be considered to be the opposite approach. So often Taoism and Confucianism are often sort of made analog to the Yinyang itself, right? Where we have Yang, which is active, right? And more top down, right? The heavens, bearing knowledge, right? That sort of thing. That's very much in line with Confucian philosophy, right? And the idea of virtue coming in a top down sort of manner. Taoism is more analogous to yin, right? The dark, the passive, the bottom up from the earth, right? Or so in our case, right? We're not looking for authorities or exemplars to demonstrate what virtue is. In Taoism, it's very much the opposite. Society is the reason why we have gotten to the place we are. So instead of just trying to capture an earlier moment in society, when the Taoists talk about the golden age, they're talking about something pre-social, something very, very long ago, right? When people were just acting in line with their spontaneous intuitions. Okay, so if we want to have a sort of general compare and contrast of Confucianism and Taoism, associate Confucianism with more of a yang type of philosophy, right? More aggressive, more active, more masculine, right? Versus Taoism, which is more of a yin, more passive philosophy, definitely elevating things that we might historically associate with the feminine. right? And so we'll see exactly what that looks like. But there's an interesting story of, exactly how Laozi came to write the Daodejing. We'll talk a little bit about that, and it's also in his bio. But so just a little bit there of a compare and contrast. So still trying to alleviate suffering, but just at the moment, right? Not trying to escape samsara necessarily, like we saw in the Indian traditions. Now, another difference that we're going to see between Taoism and Confucianism is that there is a much more explicit distinction between religious Taoism and philosophical Taoism. Whereas when it comes to Confucianism as a religion versus a philosophy, there's not much differentiation, except that in religious Confucianism, you're going to see a lot more ancestral worship, right? But that is very common in philosophical Confucian practice as well. So again, really not much of a difference there. But again, for Taoism, very, very distinct difference. And the difference is going to be in the end goal. So for philosophical Taoism, when, if we use similar language like we did for Indian philosophies, right? We talked about moksha, we talked about nirvana, right? Seeking enlightenment. If we're looking for something analogous in Chinese traditions in terms of seeking enlightenment, right? Well, in the Confucian tradition, we already saw it's cultivating Ren, right? That master virtue, becoming a junzi, becoming a sage, right? Mastering the virtues. That's an enlightened being. In Taoist tradition, right, we're going to get two understandings of enlightenment, right? The philosophical one is going to be much more like the Confucian idea, right? That there's going to be virtue that we can cultivate, and that there's certain ways in which people will live their lives if they do in fact embody those virtues, right? So what type of person, right, we should be looking after. But in the religious tradition, you actually do achieve this sort of mythical transmutation of your body where you become immortal. And it's really interesting because the myth, in fact, states that in religious Taoism, when you achieve enlightenment, your body is picked up by this giant bird, a giant crane, and is taken up into the mountains where you'll live forever with the other immortals, the holy immortals. So it's very interesting, very different from philosophical Taoism. We're going to focus on the philosophical tradition, but I'm going to tell you a little bit about the religious tradition so you get a sense of not just its role, but also its significance in our everyday lives, specifically with regards to alchemy. So again, right, the goal here is to achieve physical immortality. And so within the Taoist tradition, you'll often see the practice of things like Tai-chi, using different types of tinctures to remedy, right, ailments in the body. What's the one with the needles? Acupuncture, right? These are all things that we now call like traditional Chinese medicine, right? Or something like this. But in fact, they started out as alchemist attempts to turn your body into something that would live forever. So we can actually thank a lot of modern medicine for early spiritual attempts at immortality. Right, so some interesting ways in which we benefit a lot from these types of views. Right, so, but we're going to be focusing on not how you achieve immortality. Again, there's some information in the PowerPoint about that, but more so on Laozi's idea of how we cultivate ritual and how that's going to differ from the Confucian view. Okay, so again, happening around the same time in ancient China, a little bit earlier. Laozi is born a little bit earlier than Kongzi, but their philosophies didn't really become prominent until around the same time. Laozi, like other figures that we've seen, has a sort of interesting birth story. He is described as being born like an old man with a beard, so his name literally means old master. And so that's why he's always depicted in this way. But again, we might not take that literally. I don't think he had like Benjamin Button syndrome or something, but it's probably a nod to the wisdom, right? The prophecy of his significance. Okay, so again, we're going to see an emphasis on the Tao or the way for peace and harmony. And there too, Kongzi talked about the way here and there, but wasn't going to focus on it nearly as much as Laozi is. right? So here's a little bit about religious Daoism, some different views of the immortals and, you know, the various traditions with regard to personal metaphysics, right? So our sense of who we are, because if you are immortal, right, you're going to have some sort of account, and especially if it's based on alchemy, some sort of account of how our physical being, which is currently temporary, can somehow be transmuted into something that can live forever, right? And so we get this very interesting metaphysics of the self from religious Daoism there, if you're interested. So for Laozi, though, right, we're going to focus on him for the philosophical tradition. And the text that is the one that we're going to focus on is the Daodejing. It's called The Way and Its Power. But just so you understand what the words actually mean, Dao means the way or virtue. Okay. Or sorry, Dao means the way. De means virtue or power. Jing just designates it as a classic. So anytime you see Jing at the end of anything, no, it's a classic text, right? In the Chinese tradition. So there are going to be other classical texts as well, especially under the Confucian tradition, 5 classics in particular, but Daodejing, right? That's the power or the significance there. So the Daodejing is broken up into 2 main parts, right? One focusing on an explanation of the Dao itself, understanding its nature, and then one focusing on de or virtue, right? How exactly we cultivate virtue, what that looks like in a Taoist sense. So I have 2 selections from the Daodejing. One will be focused on the former and one on the latter. So just like the Analects in Confucianism, there is some debate as to who wrote what exactly, right? So Kongza himself, right, never wrote anything down. It was his disciples who were writing down the accounts of what was going on. And even though Laozi is acknowledged as probably having written some of the Daodejing, it's most likely authored by a number of people over a long period of time, many of which were probably his disciples. So we're giving credit, but acknowledging, right, that there might be some historical inaccuracy there. But again, the central teaching of the Daodejing is this focus on the Dao, right, understanding what exactly it means. What is the way? What is this thing? And what's going to be sort of counterintuitive about Taoism is the way they describe things. You're going to see the use of paradox a lot. Does anyone know what a paradox is? Sorry, the geese are going crazy. Does anyone know what a paradox is? Yes, good, right? So we have this sort of impossible scenario. And typically it's going to involve 2 choices, one of 2 choices, the idea usually being that neither works. Okay, so the paradox of Taoism is that every bit of knowledge that's going to be conveyed by Laozi is not knowledge, right? So it's all going to be saying something and then saying the exact opposite of that thing. And so our job is to try to understand what is going on. Why does he keep contradicting himself? Why is he saying things and then saying the opposite? What are we supposed to understand? What are we supposed to come to learn about nature, right? In this way. Cats are chasing each other. Something's in the air. Something's in the air. The animals are going crazy. Right? So we're going to work through this to try to get a sense of what he's talking about. So starting off here, right, the central teaching of the Daodejing is that there is a nameless, changeless, invisible reality to which we can attune ourselves. So I like that word attune, especially if we're understanding things like Tai-chi as being part of how we attune ourselves to nature, right? So the types of movements that you do in Tai Chi are very slow, right? They're meant to use as little effort and energy as possible, right? And the idea, I sort of see it as like, do you remember those like old TVs or radios with antennas and you have to sort of like wiggle them around to get the signal? I feel like it's like that with your body, right? So you are the antenna. You are trying to attune yourself to the natural flows of energy or chi, right, that are out there in the universe. And the idea is that the closer that we can attune our bodies and our livelihoods to those natural flows of energy, the less suffering there will be. right? So the idea there is that, again, all of the suffering that we are experiencing in society is a direct result of our distancing ourselves from nature, of our removal of ourselves from the Tao, right? So we need to embrace this nameless, changeless thing, right? But at the same time, even though it's changeless, it also is always changing. Even though it's nameless, it has a name, the Tao, right? So we're going to get a lot of this apparent contradictory, paradoxical language. But that is going to be for a very particular reason, right? So I'm going to let that reveal itself as we go. Okay, so am I still sharing my screen with you guys or no? I don't think I am. Okay, so understanding the yin yang here a little bit more, right? We didn't dive into this as much in Confucianism, but I do recommend you watch the lecture that I posted, which talks about it specifically in relationship to gender inequality. But again, if we're understanding Confucianism and Daoism as embodying different aspects of yin and yang, right? Even those emphasis on different genders is really informative. So this entire element, right, is part of a larger metaphysical picture, which is known as the I Ching. Has anyone ever heard of that? I think I have a picture of it in here. It's the yin yang symbol with all of the different lines and dashes around it, like this. Some of them are quite elaborate. Does that ring familiar at all to any of you? Even if it doesn't, the idea here is that all of these symbols, right, are just mappings of the different manifestations of how yin and yang interact with each other, right? So it's really, we can boil it down to the yin yang, but from the yin yang, right, from the Tao, the Wei, which is the intermingling of these things, we get the I Ching, which is this huge metaphysics of nature, right? This huge map of the elements, right, of what exists, what it is like. Okay, so this entire picture is meant to provide a map of the order and totality of the universe, right? So it's literally a map of the universe. And so when trying to understand, you know, exactly how this works, what practitioners would often do is practice by engaging with the I Ching. So what that would mean is that you don't actually have, like, the I Ching is not necessarily like a physical text sometimes. It can often be a collection of sticks where people will drop the sticks on the ground, and then the way that they fall when they sticks cross each other, that's a broken line on the I Ching. When they fall and they're not crossing over each other, that's a solid line. And based on how the sticks fall to the ground, someone can interpret which symbols from the I Ching, right? And again, there are hundreds of them, which are being called. And then you can give prophecies until the future, right? You can get information from nature, right? So that we can better make decisions on how to live within it, right? So it's really interesting tradition, really interesting view of how to understand I like this, the rhythm of the world, right? How things are moving. Another, again, emphasis here is that the opposites of the yin yang make up its unified whole. And this is going to be the key to understanding the paradox that Laozi rests on when describing the Tao and when describing virtue in the Taoist tradition. The reason why he's going to say things that seem opposite is because we can only take it in their entirety to get the truth, right? So we have to understand that the Tao is both nameless and named. So let's just pause there for 1 second. What could we possibly mean by that? If we say something is both nameless and named, how does taking a holistic picture of that tell us anything? What can we garner from that? Maud, what do you think? We say something is both nameless and named. What does that tell us about that thing? Kevin, any thoughts? What can we learn from something that is two sides of the same coin, two truths? Okay, but what does that tell us? truth. How can those things both be true? How can it both be true that it is nameless and also named? Might help to think back to what we learned about Hinduism. When we learned about Brahman, right? The ultimate reality, everything, infinity, right? Obviously, we can't talk about the infinite thing, right? It's present yet absent. Yeah, good. So there are two conflicting truths going on, right? On the one sense, these entities are infinite, right? So they can't be described, because you can't describe something that's infinite. You would need an infinite amount of words and description to be able to do that. But then, of course, at the same time, we can talk about part of Brahman, right? And the parts of Brahman that can be talked about are then given specific names. So we can think of that similarly here. When Laozi is saying these things that seem contradictory, that seem paradoxical, what he's really trying to do is break our minds of this idea that it has to be one or the other, that these two things can both be true at the same time, and only by understanding both of them can we truly get a sense of the thing as a whole, right? Yes, we have to have a name for it because we're talking about it. We have to, work towards this thing. So language is important. But on the other hand, language is limited, right? Language is fallible. So language is never going to get at the complexity of an infinite thing like the Tao, right? So in that sense, it's also nameless. Language will never sufficiently be able to capture what this is, but we do also have to talk about it. And here's what we can say about it, right? So keep these things in mind. Every time he's saying something that contradicts the same thing he just said before, it's for this reason, right? That only by taking those two seemingly contradictory truths as together can we get a sense of a unified picture of truth. Good. Okay, so again, cannot be named or defined, but then of course we're going to see names for it and we're going to see definitions for it. So it is important to understand that the yin-yang is not deified. So I made that connection to Brahman, but Brahman does get deified in the Hindu traditions, right? We get that pantheon of gods. So we're not going to see that here. We're not going to see embodiments of the yin-yang, but what we will see is when Taoism started to become practiced in rural indigenous areas, whatever local gods those communities worshipped were sort of absorbed by the Taoist temples. So there will often be deities in Taoist temples, and it's not even necessarily going to be the holy immortals. It will most likely just be whatever local deity, typically tied to weather or production of crops and things like this, the sea, something like some elemental force, right? So we don't end up seeing that typical sort of cosmic father paternalistic figure. When the yin yang is personified in any shape or form in Taoist literature, it's actually given feminine gendered pronouns, right? So it's described more like a cosmic mother, like the womb, right? That the universe inhabits, right? That's how everything comes from the yin yang, is that we're all sort of housed within it. And when emphasizing one side over the other, although balance is ideal, right? Taoism is going to emphasize yin, right? And of course, Confucianism is going to emphasize yang, as I mentioned before. But again, in terms of gender, yin is seen as a more feminine creative power. So given that elevation of the feminine power in Taoism, right, we might then anticipate seeing a little bit more room for women to have positions of authority there. But again, it's really just important to note the difference here with Confucianism, right? Are we emphasizing the cultivation of virtue through more passive means or through more active enforcement, right? So again, the idea is that it's our active separation from the Tao through society that has caused the pain we're having now. So we need to return to the way. And any description of Tian or heaven, also mentioned in Confucianism. I mentioned in Confucianism, it just referred to moral authority, right? Bestowed on the emperor, right? And those in power. Here, it's just referring to nature, right? Attunement with nature. Okay, so let me pause there for a second. Any questions so far? So continuing on with what I was saying about the limitations of language. We can talk about Taoist epistemology now. So epistemology, again, in philosophy is the study of knowledge, right? So what knowledge is possible. And here we see a lot more skepticism from the Taoists than we saw from Confucians, right? So the idea in Confucianism was that there are sages, right? There are junzas, there are masters, right, of virtue. So we're giving epistemic authority to some people on, you know, someone has to know the good thing if we're going to go to them to be our teacher. Here in Taoism, we see the very opposite. You're not going to see an emphasis on teachers. You're not going to see an emphasis on the texts, even the Daodejing, because there is such a strong emphasis on skepticism within the Taoist tradition, right? So skepticism on, you know, can happen on different degrees, right? So you can be what's called a Pyrrhonian skeptic, which means you just are skeptical of everything. But then there are more moderate degrees of skepticism, right, which have been typically associated in the past with Western philosophers like Descartes or Hume. But this type of skepticism is much older than either of those two, and I think much more comprehensive, right? So it's saying that we can have knowledge of some things, right? So it's not a total absolute skepticism, but it is a little bit more like Cartesian skepticism in that our knowledge has to come from us, from inside. Now, for Descartes, that was using our minds as thinking things. For Taoism, it's going to be more holistically, right? The whole embodied experience. But the point is that it's not coming externally, where that was more Humean skepticism, right? David Hume says that our experiences are the only things we can trust, right? Those are the only things we shouldn't be too skeptical about. But the idea here is that instead we need to be looking within, and instead of beliefs, right, which again was very Cartesian, right, instead of our beliefs leading us to knowledge, it's more of a spontaneous intuition, right? Something we might call like a gut feeling, right? There's something else happening that's not as rational as most thought processes going on, right? And so for Confucianism, again, that active top-down, we need to learn the right things to believe from the teachers, from the texts. We need to practice them so we can figure them out. In Taoism, it's very much no, right? That is just going to give you partial truths, right? Because of the limitations of language. So it's only going to get in the way of your ability to cultivate virtue. If you think, oh, I've got this finite set of information, I'm just going to study it, and then I'll have it all figured out. There's actually a really interesting phenomena that also sort of happens with students who take critical thinking, right? So we think, oh, critical thinking skills, those are great. Students often, after taking a critical thinking class, it's not necessarily so much that their critical thinking skills have improved. They have a little bit, but their confidence in their critical is like, they think they're excellent critical thinkers, right? But the idea is that that's just a little taste, right? It's a constantly evolving bit of education, right? It's not something that you just master and then move on. So this is, I think, a good embodiment of the Taoist skepticism of education, right? You can't just go, same for what I'm teaching you in this class, you can't just go on what we're learning about Eastern philosophies, right? There's so much to learn. It should be a never-ending exploration of whichever tradition you're interested in pursuing, right? But the idea is that if you just take that finite set of information and then you think you have gained knowledge, right? What you've really done is locked yourself into an illusion, right? A misunderstanding, because you've only focused on that finite bit. Okay, so again, most traditional education is going to rely on distinctions, right? We like pointing out how different things are from each other. We like establishing which things are opposing. But according to Laozi, if the Tao, if the way is a unity of opposites, then distinguishing between those things is only going to obscure our understanding of it, right? So we can only discuss examples of what it means to live in line with the Tao, or what he calls skillful activity. Right? We can only discuss examples of spontaneous intuition because there is no unified one definition fits all, right? That would, again, succumb to the problem of language and its limitations. Okay, so because of the skepticism, we cannot just transfer knowledge from the teacher to the student the way more Confucian philosophies tended to act as education worked, right? So they rejected the use of teachers. Truth cannot be articulated due to the many limits of language, right? And also, Laozi pointed out how misleading language can be. Often when we're engaged in philosophical debates with people, it's not the truth that wins out. it's who was, a wittier person, or who, had more of the audience laughing, or who was a bigger bully and, was able to intimidate the other person more. It's not always about truth. And if any of you have studied the law, right, in legal debates, you'll know that it's often not about that, right? It's about all these other things that convince us to believe things that are not evidence-based. So similarly, right, there's no need to rely on the authority of ancient texts, right? They're just also maybe trying to persuade you to think what they think. So instead, you should try to figure out things for yourself, right? Not through a teacher, not through reading the texts, right? According to Laozi, you are already equipped with everything you need to understand the truth of this world and understand how to become a better part of it. Right? And so this leads to the three primary teachings of Taoism. The first one is return, or wuzhi. This is a return to nothingness or infinity, right? So if our goal is to attune ourselves to the Tao, well, the Tao is infinite. While the Tao is also everything, it is, right, the paradox, it's also nothing, right? So while the Tao is changeless, it also, again, changes, right? As does everything within it. Okay, so the goal then, if we're trying to not conflict with the Tao, is we should be willing to embrace all of the cycles within it. So this manifests in a couple of different ways. The primary example of this you're going to see in the Daodejing are stories of people who are old, who are sick, who are dying, rejecting treatment or rejecting anything that would interrupt the naturally occurring decay of their body, right? So the acceptance of these things as part of nature is really interesting. Another potential, impact of this is the idea that by also removing ourselves from social life, that includes traditional social structures like family, parenthood, right? So if we're supposed to be, right, going along with this return to nothingness, then maybe we don't want to contribute any more to the continuation. But also, right, part of being a natural mammal involves reproduction, right? So you could see this very much being in line with that as well, right? You're going to get Taoists on both sides of things, but it's a very, very interesting idea of what exactly it could mean to return to nothingness, to return to infinity. This leads to the most important teaching, though, I think, which is wuwei, or non-action. This is how we go about cultivating virtue in the Taoist tradition. And just like the paradoxes before, this too is going to be a little unclear, right? So even though it's called non-action, it doesn't mean we're doing nothing, right? Because so you all don't get to sit at home tomorrow and be like, I'm not going to school and practicing wuwei because my teacher told me to. No, it just means that when we are acting without effort. We're acting more in line with our spontaneous intuitions or more automatic action. And we're not acting out of concern with the consequences of our actions, right? Especially if the consequences of those are self-motivated, right? So a lot of times people talk about being in the flow, right? Or being in the zone. That could very much be a description of something like a wuwei. Or I often think about, if any of you have gone on long drives, where your mind just wanders and you realize that you've been driving for an hour and you have not been paying attention to the road, right? Or you've barely been paying attention, right? But your body is just able to sort of pick up and take over, right? That muscle memory, and you're able to not put exertion into the activity. The idea is that should be the state of mind we strive for all the time, right? Though without the mind drifting elsewhere, but instead staying present. And so you're going to see other, again, interesting stories in the Daodejing, just anecdotes, examples of people like this. My favorite one is the story of the butcher, right? And so different butchers at different levels of enlightenment, right? Different stages of achieving enlightenment are going to butcher the meat differently, right? And so someone who's just starting out, right, is probably going to have to sharpen their knives every day because they're just hacking and hacking and hacking, right? So they're hitting bones and hitting ligaments and all these things. But someone who's, who's been doing this for a while, who's developing and cultivating a sense of how to work with the meat, probably only has to sharpen their knife, every few months, right? But the idea is that a virtuous person, someone who is in line with the Tao, will never have to sharpen their knife, right? They know exactly how to cut along with the meat such that they're never coming up against friction on the blade, right? So again, it's a simple sort of thing, but it's meant to demonstrate a way of being in the world, right? Not one of no involvement, right? But a way of being involved that does not lead to suffering, right? Because we are embracing the flow of things, embracing the change, going along with the Tao. And so then the third one that follows from this, right, hopefully, is non-mind or wujin. Okay, so this is the idea that if we are able to cultivate that state of wuwei, like I mentioned, again, we don't want our minds to wander, but we do want to be able to have an open mind, which means something really specific. So it's empty, right? We want an empty mind, but not empty of everything. Empty in the sense that I like this picture I used here of, keeping your hands open and water coming through, right? So your hands are empty because you're not holding on to any of the water, but your hands are also not empty because you're allowing all of the new water to go through, right? So the idea is that to have an empty mind is like keeping your palm open to new bits of information. The moment you say, oh, hey, I learned a thing and I know this is true, that's like closing your mind and saying, I've got it. The moment you close it, no new information can be captured, right? So that emptiness, I want you to think of it as an open palm, not so much as a lacking, right? But an openness to new information. So two, again, we want not to be distracted, but singularly focused. Present is typically the word we would use to describe that now. And then a stillness, right? A lack of anxiety. So you'll often hear, people talk about how if you're experiencing depression, you're living in the past, right? Because you're worried about things that have already happened. If you're experiencing anxiety, you're living in the future because you're worried about things that haven't happened yet, right? So being present is just focusing on what is happening here and now. And again, there are some incredibly empirically provable benefits to this sort of thinking. This is what a lot of cognitive psychologists would recommend you do if you are experiencing some sort of panic attack, right? They recommend you do a body check. You literally check your present physical form, each part, and you acknowledge that it's okay, right? Because your mind is elsewhere. Your mind has gone to different places. So any questions about those three main teachings? The return to nothingness, wuwei, non-action, wujin, non-mind. So we have about 5 minutes left. So with that, I'm going to share with us one more example of this paradox, and then we'll pick up the rest on Thursday. Okay, so here again is an example of the paradox I've mentioned, right? But we want to dive in deep to see exactly how engaging in this paradoxical language can possibly give us some greater insight, right? Because that's the idea. So the passage says, if you want to become whole, first let yourself be broken. If you want to become straight, let yourself be crooked. If you want to become full, let yourself be empty. If you want to be reborn, let yourself die. If you want to be given everything, give everything up. So what do we make of this? Let's start with the first one. If you want to become whole, first let yourself be broken. Want to become whole, first let yourself be broken. So should we all go let ourselves get beaten up? What's this telling? No, what is this telling us to do? Good, Joseph. If we want to be whole, let yourself be broken. Good, right? So maybe the wholeness of human experience involves the vulnerability, right, that comes from being broken, right? Absolutely. Great. Okay, let's go to the next one. If you want to become straight, let yourself be crooked. You don't think they mean like, they're not talking about posture, right? What are they talking about? They're also not talking about sexuality. What are they talking about? Want to become straight. There's a reason they're called crooks, right? Yes, good, right? So here too, just like perhaps some brokenness is involved in being whole, right? Perhaps in order to understand morality, right? To be an upright person, that's, I think, the straightness they're talking about. Being upright is typically a way of describing someone who's a good person in Chinese philosophical traditions, right? So in order to do that, you have to, get a sense of what it means to be on the other side of the law, right? Or on the other side of those moral rules. And this is something we saw in Confucianism actually as well. In Confucian virtue ethics, you have to struggle with the temptation to do the wrong thing in order to understand why it's right, right? So here we're getting a little bit of that same idea, right? That it's not just one or the other, right? That becoming a good person, cultivating virtue involves seeing things from different sides, right? Not just two opposing sides, but as many sides as possible. Good. If you want to become full, let yourself be empty. Again, here too, we can think of, right, the privilege that some people have in literally filling up their biological needs, whatever those may be, right? If they've never experienced going without, if they've never experienced poverty or any type of real need, they're probably never really going to know what it means to be satisfied then either, right? So adjusting our expectations, being able to see from different perspectives, readjust our priorities, right? And value things differently. If you are used to having everything, right, then you're not going to know what it is to be full. Whereas if you're used to having nothing, becoming full will become quite easy, I would imagine. And then if you want to be reborn, let yourself die. Here too, again, we can think of Buddhism, right? Not being attached to our sense of self, right? So if you want to change who you are, stop being so attached to the previous version of yourself, right? You can be that very new version of yourself right now. Good. And then if you want to be given everything, give everything up, right? So the idea is, again, perhaps we're mistaking our material possessions for what it really means to have everything and be happy. So take these things into consideration. Maybe you disagree with Lao Tzu. Maybe you think this is a bunch of nonsense, but ruminate on it a little bit, right? Do you think the truths about the world are so black and white? It's just this or that? Or do you think it's more complex, like what Lao Tzu is trying to get at? That even two seemingly paradoxical and contradictory things can actually work together to give us a greater picture of the ultimate truth, right? So keep that in mind. Otherwise, I'll hang out for a few minutes if there are any questions, but I'll see you guys on Thursday. Have a great week.